Hello and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. Please sign up at my Patreon to get episodes earlier, bonuses, to have a say on future content, and to interact with me and other Warbirders directly. But mainly you'll have the satisfaction of helping keep this podcast going. You can also toss me a tip via PayPal at WOWB17, or even just drop me a review. Thank you for your support. Now on to the show. Hello Warbirders! I want to start by giving a huge shout out to our newest Patreon member, Chase Stolman. Chase is a student at South Dakota Mines University, working on a competitive racer design for a worldwide airplane design competition. And he's been drawing inspiration from some of our favorite classics like the P-38, P-51, and the XP-67. In case you forgot what that was, that's the Moonbat. And I'm honored to hear that the podcast has played a part in his creative process. Thanks for the support, Chase, and please keep us up to date. All right, let's dive in. So this is a part 2 about the two big Japanese flying boat sisters. If you can, go ahead and listen to Mavis first, but if you can't, here's a recap. The Kawanishi H6K Mavis was the undisputed queen of Pacific distance. A 4-engine flying destroyer that utilized its legendary 24-hour endurance to serve as the long-range eyes of the Imperial Japanese Navy. With a massive 131-foot parasol-type wing, braced by a forest of draggy struts, it operated from remote lagoons, carrying a potent mix of Type 91 torpedoes or bombs, and had a tail turret that could surprise overconfident interceptors. However, by 1942, the Mavis had become a flying torch. Its lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks made it vulnerable to faster Allied hunters, like the B-17 Misfit, which famously shredded Lieutenant Hitoshi Usuji's aircraft in a grueling 20-minute lumbering dogfight. As the air war intensified, this vulnerable pioneer was gradually relegated to transport and courier duties, clearing the way for its successor. So now let's learn about the H8K Emily, arguably the most advanced flying boat of the war. So, just as the Kawanishi H6K Mavis was entering service in 1938, the Imperial Japanese Navy, or IJN, showed a lot of forethought by right away ordering the development of a replacement, a larger, longer-ranged patrol aircraft, which they called Navy Experimental 13She Large-Size Flying Boat. She was eventually called the H8K, and the Allies dubbed her the Emily. Rather than just tinkering with the basic airframe of the Mavis, Kawanishi designers fully scrapped the draggy, strut-heavy parasol wing of the H6K and went right back to the drawing board in favor of a much sleeker shoulder wing design. If you know the British Sunderland, the Empire flying boats, or even the American Pan Am Clippers, then you know the basic look. This cleaned up airframe would have much less drag and would allow for much better performance. What would also help in this regard was the upgrade to the engines. Mavis had 4 1,000 horsepower Mitsubishi Kinsei radials, while her sister would get 4 1,850 horsepower Mitsubishi Kasais with water injection driving 4-blade propellers. Although the wingspan of Emily was a bit shorter, she was 2 meters longer and had a much deeper hull, giving her a far more massive fuselage volume, allowing the carrying of more stuff. To solve the vulnerability that turned the Mavis into a flying torch, the H8K was improved with 6 large, partially self-sealing fuel tanks in the hull that used multiple layers of natural rubber and silk. When a bullet pierced the tank, the fuel reacted with the rubber, causing it to swell and plug the hole instantly. Although her 8 smaller fuel tanks in the wings were still not self-sealing. Another handy feature, and one that I've never heard of before, was that if a hull fuel tank was pierced, the fuel would drain into the bilge and could be pumped back into the undamaged tanks. As someone who carefully checks the fuel in my Cessna tanks for water or filth before every flight, this seems a bit hazardous, but maybe they had good filters to take care of it. The fuel capacity was 4,500 gallons, or 17,040 liters. Now, fire extinguishers in aircraft engines was a pretty standard thing everywhere, and all aircraft would carry handheld fire extinguishers. But the CO2 fire suppression system on the H8K Emily was a cutting-edge piece of safety engineering that made it one of the most fire-resistant aircraft of the war. And this was a direct evolution from the flying torch reputation of the Mavis. Emily featured a fully integrated, semi-automatic carbon dioxide, CO2, network designed to smother fires before they could consume the airframe. It effectively made the entire aircraft a fire extinguisher, and perhaps even more importantly, a fire preventer. The heart of the system consisted of several high-pressure steel flasks filled with liquid CO2, tucked into the lower fuselage or near the main wing spars. These were connected to a complex manifold of aluminum or copper tubing that spiderwebbed throughout the aircraft's most dangerous zones, the engine nacelles and the fuel tank bays. The system wasn't designed to spray a little mist. It was designed to displace oxygen entirely in enclosed strategic flooding zones. Not surprisingly, and like most aircraft of the era, there were extinguishers in the engine nacelles. If an engine caught fire, the pilot or flight engineer could pull a cockpit lever to flood that specific nacelle with CO2. This would starve the fire of oxygen instantly. More interesting was the fuel tank bays. The Emily's massive self-sealing tanks were housed in voids within the hull and wings. The CO2 system was piped directly into these voids. By filling the space around the tanks with inert CO2 gas, any spark from an incendiary round would find no oxygen to ignite the fuel vapors. Even more surprising was the inerting process, which was used proactively. If a crew knew that they were about to enter a heavy combat zone or were being chased by an enemy, the flight engineer would inert the fuel bays to prevent fire. By partially discharging the CO2 into the area surrounding the tank, they created an atmosphere where fire literally could not exist. That meant that even if a bullet pierced a tank, there was no oxygen available to turn that leak into a fireball. Remember the fuel in the bilge pump trick? The CO2 system worked in tandem with the Emily's unique fuel recovery design. Because the bottom of the Emily's hull acted as a giant catch basin for leaked fuel, it was also the most dangerous place for a fire. Kawanishi engineers placed high-volume CO2 discharge nozzles in the lower hull bilges to ensure that even a massive fuel leak wouldn't lead to a catastrophic explosion. What good is a surviving fuel system if the crew is too dead to benefit from it? Kawanishi wanted to protect the human element of the Emily also. They added nearly 3,000 pounds, 1,360 kilograms, to the aircraft's empty weight compared to the earlier H8K model with armor protections to increase survivability. The pilot and co-pilot were protected by 6mm to 8mm of hardened steel plating. And amazingly, the engineers didn't just bolt the plates flat. They were often angled at about 30 to 45 degrees. In ballistics, an angled 8mm plate effectively behaves like 11mm or 12mm of steel, which was enough to deflect or tumble standard 30 caliber rounds and significantly slow down 50 caliber slugs from long range. And it wasn't just the flight crew that was protected. Unlike the Mavis, where gunners stood in open blisters or behind thin glass, the Emily's key combat positions, nose, tail, and dorsal turrets were reinforced with 5mm to 7mm steel plates. So not only was Emily designed to be a flying boat, she was kinda designed to be a flying tank. So one technique for survival might be the ability to take punishment, but another is the ability to mete it out in order to keep attackers away. Or even better, to destroy them before they destroy you. And for this, Emily was seriously outgunned compared to her sister. While the Mavis relied on a single 20mm cannon in the tail and light 7.7mm machine guns, Emily was fairly bursting with guns. The Emily carried 5 20mm Type 99 Model 1 cannon. As a reminder, cannon aren't just machine guns flinging slugs. They fired explosive shells that could tear the wing off a fighter or shred the engine of a B-17. They were strategically placed to cover almost every angle of attack. The nose had a swivel mount to discourage head-on attacks. The tail had a powered turret that served as the primary deterrent for anyone trying to sit on the Emily's 6. The dorsal cannon was a massive glass-enclosed turret on the hump of the fuselage, providing a 360-degree field of fire against diving attacks. 2 waist hatches allowed gunners to fire 20mm cannon broadsides at any aircraft trying to make a side pass. If that wasn't enough, Emily carried 5 extra 7.7mm Type 92 machine guns. These were utilized in positions where a heavy cannon wasn't practical or where suppressive fire was needed to keep a fighter at a distance. 2 were located in the cockpit side windows for the pilots or flight engineers to use. 2 more were in ventral bottom hatches, covering the blind spot beneath the aircraft where fighters often tried to hide. The final gun was located in a hatch behind the dorsal turret. One of the biggest technological leaps from the Mavis to the Emily was the introduction of powered turrets. In the Mavis, gunners had to manually manhandle their guns against the high-speed wind resistance of a 200-mile-per-hour aircraft. In the Emily, the tail and dorsal turrets were electrically or hydraulically assisted, allowing the gunners to track fast-moving Allied fighters like the P-38 or F-4F Wildcat with much greater precision. Lastly, the overlapping fields of fire were carefully planned. For example, if a fighter attacked from rear high, it wasn't just facing the tail gunner, it was staring down the barrels of both the tail cannon and the dorsal turret. This mutually supporting fire meant that there was almost no safe angle to approach Emily. You'd think that all this extra protective stuff would come with a serious performance penalty, but no. Remember that she was a much more slippery airframe, and she had much more powerful engines. So even with all the extra weight, Emily could hit speeds of nearly 290 miles per hour, nearly 70 miles per hour faster than Mavis. Okay, so she was well protected and fast, but what could Emily do to the enemy? Emily was designed to be as much of a threat to ships and ground targets as it was to intercepting fighters. Because it was a flying boat, it couldn't have a traditional internal bomb bay, which would have compromised the watertight integrity of the hull, so all of its offensive teeth were carried externally. For ship killing, Emily could carry 2 800-kilogram, that's 1,764-pound, Type 91 torpedoes. These were slung on massive racks located on the undersides of the inner wing sections between the hull and the inboard engines. With its 290 miles per hour top speed, an Emily was hopefully going to be significantly harder for shipboard AA gunners to track than the older, slower Mavis, making it a terrifyingly effective maritime strike platform. She could also carry 2,000 kilograms, 4,400 pounds of bombs or depth charges, all on external racks. Now, for such an advanced flying boat, one that is sometimes stated to be the best one of the war, I was surprised that Emily didn't have an in-flight reloading capability, similar to the short Sunderland. As you might remember from the Sunderland episode, the famous British flying boat had an ingenious setup that allowed it to reload ordnance from inside without heading back to base. The bomb racks were mounted on tracks that allowed them to be winched into the upper fuselage through 2 large panels under the wing roots. The crew could physically stand inside the aircraft, hook up new 250-pound bombs or depth charges to the racks, and then wind them back out to the wings. This allowed the Sunderland to stay on station and conduct multiple attacks without returning to base. And by the way, what did Emily look like? She didn't look at all like her sister, but she did have an uncanny resemblance to the Sunderland. So if you think of a Sunderland painted up in IJN livery, well then you're thinking of Emily. All of these plans and ideas sounded great. It was time to build a prototype. And based on our knowledge of the success of the earlier Kawanishi flying boats, it must have been freaking fantastic, right? Wrong. It was a frickin' disaster. The transition from the elegant Mavis to the powerhouse Emily was nearly derailed by a prototype that was quite literally a disaster on the water. When the first H8K prototype water taxied out in December 1940, Kawanishi's engineers realized that they had built an aerodynamic masterpiece that was a hydrodynamic nightmare. The biggest hurdle was Emily's unstable water handling. Because of its deep hull and high center of gravity, the prototype suffered from severe porpoising on the water, a dangerous rhythmic pitching during takeoff and landing. It looks just like it sounds. As the aircraft gained speed, the nose would begin to bounce. If the pilot didn't catch it immediately, these oscillations would grow more violent until the 70,000-pound machine threatened to either dive nose first into a water loop and do an imitation of a submarine, or stall out and smash back down into the lagoon. Another problem was the blinding spray. The initial hull design was such that massive sheets of spray were kicked up. Yes, this was bad for pilot visibility during the takeoff run, but these sheets of water could also be sucked directly into the inboard propellers and engines. So it wasn't just a visibility issue. The salt water threatened to choke out the Kasai engines and erode the propeller blades before the plane even reached takeoff speed. So to save the project, Kawanishi had to go back to the drawing board, and they performed some major changes of how the aircraft met the sea. These were incorporated into two new prototypes where the bugs were ironed out, and these became pre-production aircraft into December 1941. So how did they fix the problems? Firstly, engineers added long, curved, longitudinal spray suppressor strips, metal fences along the chines of the forward hull. These acted to deflect water outward and downward and kept those hard-working engines dry. Whoa, Brian, slow down. What the heck's a chine? Okay. So it's a longitudinal line with a sharp change in the cross-section profile of the fuselage or similar body. Okay, Brian, but what does that look like? Well, the best example I can think of is decidedly out of my era, but it will answer your question right away, so we're going to use it. Think of the SR-71 Blackbird. The sharp edges along the sides of the fuselage? Yes, those are chines. Next, they refined the step. Here we go again with another new concept, Brian. So what's a step? In the world of flying boats, the step is the most critical piece of engineering you'll never see while the plane is in flight. Without it, Mavis and Emily and the others would have been little more than high-speed, over-engineered motorboats that would have never actually left the water. To understand why, we have to look at the physics of suction. When a flying boat like the Emily is sitting still, it's a displacement hull. It sits deep in the water. As the pilot shoves the balls to the wall on the throttles on those four 1,850 horsepower Kasai engines, the plane begins to move faster, but the water doesn't want to let go. Because water is dense and sticky, it creates a massive amount of surface tension and suction along the flat bottom of the hull. Without a break in the hull, the faster the plane goes, the harder the water sucks the tail down. You could have 10,000 horsepower, and the plane would just plow through the waves until it eventually swamped itself. So the step is a literal, sharp, vertical notch cut into the bottom of the hull, usually located right along the center of gravity. As the Emily gains speed, air is drawn down behind this notch. This introduces bubbles and aerated water under the rear half of the hull. This air pocket breaks the suction seal. Suddenly, the aircraft is no longer wading through the water, it is planing on top of it. This is the moment a pilot feels the nose drop slightly and the speed suddenly surge. The plane is now on the step, skimming the surface like a flat stone. So Kawanishi's engineers moved the step and deepened the notch. This allowed the 70,000-pound beast to break the water's grip cleanly and rise onto its planing surface much earlier. This would work with landing too. With a smooth hull, the moment the Emily touched down at 90 miles per hour, the suction would grab the tail and slam the nose into the water, which was known as a water loop. The step ensures that as the plane slows down, it settles back into the water predictably, allowing the air to bleed out and the hull to regain its displacement. Are you enjoying this show? Please support it at World of Warburn's Patreon. It's only $5 a month. I've had a couple of folks leave Patreon lately, and it's a little discouraging. If I'm doing something you don't like, please let me know. If you're presently listening to this through Patreon, well then thank you for your support. You can also toss me a tip via PayPal at WOWB17. You can give me a review or share me with a friend. It all helps, and I appreciate it more than you know. So the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service accepted the first production version, followed by all the design work, as the H8K-1, Navy Type 2 Flying Boat Model 11. 14 of those would be built. The H8K-2 was an upgrade with more powerful engines, revised armament, and an increase in fuel capacity. This was the main variant, and 112 were produced. There was also a dedicated transport version called the H8K2L Saiku, meaning clear sky. The side blisters, ventral defensive hatch, and dorsal turret were all discarded, as were its hull fuel tanks. This reduced its range, but allowed it to carry 62 troopers, and 36 examples of this type were built. It's early morning, Hawaii, and Japanese aircraft drone towards the Hawaiian Islands to attack American military facilities. You think, I've seen this movie before. It's Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1942, the Day of Infamy, right? But no, you haven't. This is the lesser-known sequel. It also didn't do as well at the box office. This is Pearl Harbor 2, March 4th, 1942. The Day of Emily. Okay, enough movie metaphors. Let's look at the actual follow-up attack on Hawaii that really did involve our heroine today, Emily. The second raid on Pearl Harbor, officially known as Operation K, was one of the most audacious, long-ranged air missions of World War II, as well as being very little known. It was designed to take advantage of the Emily's range and paired defensive and offensive hitting power and hit the heart of the U.S. Navy from thousands of miles away, further eroding any American sense of security that remained after the December 7th attacks. While the first raid used hundreds of planes and a massive carrier fleet, Operation K relied on just 2 Emily flying battleships. The idea was to hit the fuel farms and repair docks at Pearl Harbor. The solution was a 4,800-mile round trip from the Marshall Islands. But even with the Emily's massive fuel capacity, it just couldn't make the trip in one go. Refueling would have to happen somewhere, so the Japanese planned a daring mid-ocean rendezvous at French Frigate Shoals, a remote atoll about 500 miles northwest of Hawaii. 3 submarines, I-15, I-19, and I-26, would be dispatched to the atoll, carrying aviation fuel in their ballast tanks instead of seawater. The Emilys would land in the open lagoon, pull alongside the subs and pump fuel across the waves. The plan was contingent on arriving at Hawaii with good enough visibility to bomb visually at night to avoid the growing American fighter screen. So how would the Japanese know the weather in Hawaii? Luckily, they could read the Americans' weather code. But as a backup, another submarine, I-23, would be stationed just south of Oahu as a lifeguard and weather spotter for the flying boats. On September 4th, 1942, two Emilys, commanded by Lieutenant Hisao Hashizume and Ensign Shosuke Sasao, lifted off from H8K Atoll. They each carried 4 250-kilogram, that's 550-pound bombs, and made a successful flight to French frigate Shoals, where they landed and refueled. So far, everything was going great. Actually, it wasn't all great. 3 days before the raid, the U.S. had changed their weather code, and the Japanese could not read it yet. Well, luckily, they had the I-23 to send back weather reports. Actually, no. She had stopped responding at the end of February and was actually never seen again. But Hashizume and Sasao took off from French frigate Shoals because the weather was fine there. How different could it possibly be in Hawaii? Turns out, it could be pretty different. As the Emilys approached Oahu, they hit a massive, thick layer of clouds. Visibility was 0. Hashizume and Sasao became separated in the soup. The disadvantage was also an advantage to them, too. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, the Americans had installed new radar sets. At 1:41 a.m., the Emilys had been picked up 200 miles out. P-40 Warhawks were scrambled to intercept, and Consolidated PB4Y Catalina flying boats were also sent to seek out the Japanese aircraft carriers, as the U.S. figured that it had to be another carrier attack. But the Emilys pressed on. Mucking around in the soup over Oahu, Lieutenant Hashizume completely lost visual contact with his wingman, Ensign Sasao. With the island locked down in total blackout, the only guide he had were tiny flickering patches of land visible through the clouds. Between 2 a.m. and 2:15 a.m., Hashizume mistook the dark mass of the island for the harbor and pickled his 4 250-kilogram bombs. They didn't hit the fuel farms. Instead, they slammed into the slopes of Mount Tantalus, an extinct volcanic cone just north of Honolulu. The blast radius was roughly 1,000 feet from Roosevelt High School, leaving behind massive craters but doing nothing more than shattering some neighborhood windows. While Hashizume was cratering a volcano and breaking windows, Sasao was having even worse luck. Unable to find a single hole in the clouds to verify his position, historians believe he simply called it and jettisoned his payload into the Pacific, likely off the coast of Waiwane or the entrance to the harbor, before turning his Emily back towards the southwest. The return journey turned into a grueling test of the Emily's legendary range. While Sasao touched down safely at the primitive base at H8K Atoll, Hashizume was nursing a wounded bird. His hull had been damaged during the takeoff from French frigate Shoals, and he knew H8K wouldn't have the repair facilities to fix his Emily. So instead of stopping, Hashizume pushed the Emily even further, flying non-stop past H8K all the way to their main headquarters at Jetuit Atoll. By the time he touched down, he'd officially logged the longest bombing mission in history at that point, a nearly 4,800-mile odyssey that proved that the Emily could outlast and outdistance anything else in the sky. While Operation K caused almost no physical damage, it caused a strategic panic that had far-reaching consequences. The U.S. Navy realized that if the Japanese could refuel flying boats at French frigate Shoals, maybe they could strike the west coast, or Midway, at will. So they immediately occupied French frigate Shoals and stationed a permanent garrison there. When the Japanese tried to launch a second K mission months later to scout the U.S. fleet before the Battle of Midway, they found the atoll occupied. Without that refueling stop, the Emilys just couldn't scout Pearl Harbor, leaving the Japanese blind to the location of the American carriers. A gap in intelligence that arguably led to the Japanese disaster at Midway. After the high-stakes drama of Operation K, the Emily transitioned from a strategic wonder weapon into a dependable and finally overworked workhorse of a shrinking empire. As the Allied island-hopping campaign accelerated, Emily evolved into many different roles. Emily became the primary long-range scouts for the Solomons and Gilbert Islands campaigns. They shadowed Allied task forces for hours, staying just outside the range of shipboard AA using their Type 3 H6 radar, one of the few Japanese planes to carry it effectively, to track ship movements. This was the era when the Emily earned a more fearsome reputation among Allied pilots than most Japanese aircraft that were built very light and frankly flammable. Because of its 20mm cannon and sloped armor, it was one of the only Japanese aircraft that Allied aircraft would think twice about diving on. By 1944, the U.S. Navy submarine fleet was actively strangling Japan's supply lines. The Emily was pressed into anti-submarine warfare, ASW. Equipped with improved sea search radar and carrying depth charges on its external wing rails, Emily patrolled the shipping lanes. While its endurance was perfect for sub-hunting, the Emily was now facing the big blue blanket of Hellcats and Corsairs. Despite its armor and other features, a 70,000-pound flying boat just couldn't survive a determined intercept by half a dozen F-6F Hellcats. So, in the Mavis episode, I described aerial combat between that big flying boat and a B-17. It seemed like a pretty rare event. But guess what? Out over the vast emptiness of the Pacific, maritime patrol aircraft sometimes crossed paths. And when they did, it made for a very different kind of air battle. And yes, it happened again, and this time with Emily. On the morning of December 30th, 1944, Lieutenant Graham Squires and his crew, flying a PB4Y Privateer with VPB-117, were out on patrol southwest of Formosa. They were cruising at about 6,000 feet, tucked between two cloud layers, when the top turret gunner spotted something off to the southeast, about 18 miles out. Yes, it was a Kawanishi H8K, an Emily. Squires didn't charge straight in. Instead, he did something smart. He climbed into the cloud layer to stay hidden. Using the cloud perfectly, he closed the distance from 18 miles to down to just 6 before the Japanese crew finally spotted him. At that point, the H8K turned and ran for home. What followed was a kind of cat-and-mouse game through the clouds. The Emily dove, slipping beneath the cloud layer and dropping almost to sea level, down to about 150 feet. But the privateer had radar. The AN APS-15 picked up the contact, and Squires was guided right back onto the target for the interception. He came in low, leveling off at about 200 feet, closing fast. The H8K's gunners opened up first with their big cannon. 20mm fire spat from the dorsal and tail positions, but they couldn't land a hit. Squires kept coming. Then the privateer struck. The bow gunner knocked out the dorsal turret, and moments later the Emily's No. 3 engine was hit and seriously ablaze. The top turret gunner added to the damage. The Emily was now badly hurt. Squires pulled back on the power to avoid overshooting his target. But right at that moment, the unexpected happened. The pilot of the H8K hauled his aircraft up in a sudden desperate maneuver, trying to ram the privateer out of the sky. Squires reacted instantly. Throttles forward, nose up, he hauled the big aircraft over the top of the climbing flying boat, missing it by barely 25 feet. 25 feet? That's pretty close for aircraft that are not actually trying to fly in formation. I'm sure both aircraft were on the edge of a stall, but it was the already wounded Emily that fell away to starboard, trailing smoke and finally crashing into the sea below. By 1945, an Emily in the air was a rare sight. After building 167 of them, Japan had switched to emergency fighter production, and so the production of the big flying boats had stopped. Fuel shortages also meant that these massive four-engine beasts were often grounded or hidden in coastal coves under camouflaged nets. In the end, some were used for special transport missions, flying high-ranking officials between Japan, Formosa, Taiwan, and mainland China. Out of all the Emilys built, only a handful survived the war. Many were captured on the water by strafing U.S. carrier planes, or even destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. The number eventually was whittled down until there was only one lone survivor. Emily, serial number 426, was captured by U.S. forces at the end of the war. She was flown to the United States, specifically NAS Patuxent River, for evaluation. American test pilots were quite impressed by its seaworthiness and range. Then, after years of being ignored in the U.S., it was eventually returned to Japan in 1979 and stands today at the Kanoya Air Base Museum, the last flying battleship left in the world. And if I ever get to Japan, I will be sure to visit her, along with the Tamiya headquarters located in Shizuku City. So, as I said back in the Mavis episode, there's lots more flying boats out there. The BV-138 Sea Dragon, the Dornier DO-24, the Monster BV-222 Viking, the Martin PBM Mariner, and Consolidated PB4Y Catalina, and there's the Hughes Hercules, better known as the Spruce Goose and the Martin Mars. Do you find them interesting, or is this topic kinda ho-hum? Let me know with your comments. Lastly, the story of the Emily versus Privateer dogfight made me wonder if the PB4Y Privateer got shortchanged by being bundled in with the B-24 Liberator episode. What do you think? Does she deserve an episode for herself? Thanks again to my Patreon supporters. You guys keep me getting up at 5 a.m. to make this show. You can also check out some photos of what we've been talking about on Patreon page. These are available to all. Why not join Patreon? There's a free option to join, and if you can't, well, just leave me a good review. Until next time.